have read this before I started. Well, thank you for coming. It's an early hour. It's unusual for MLconf to start this early. I know that the part of my fabulous team that's not here, being good computer scientists, are still in bed. They're in Santa Clara back in Portland. So I appreciate seeing all the smiles, and what a beautiful view, right? Unless you look really closely, you can see the traffic. In that case, maybe not so much, but anyway, got some cool stuff to talk about here and kick it off. So I wanted to challenge myself with a really, I don't know, a different topic and something that I think will have a lot of value in coming years, and that is taking what we know about or learning right off the hot press about human intelligence and baking that into machine learning and even using it to understand machine learning, which is a really interesting reflection. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about, I will bring you most of the way there. I did not completely fulfill on my promise here. It's a difficult promise to explain that theory. But I'm going to give you some tidbits along the way, and we're going to get partway there. And then hopefully over the next couple of years, we'll get all the way there with this. So first I want to acknowledge my fabulous team, like I mentioned. Several of them are here. I hope you get to meet them. They're wonderful computer scientists, programmers, and machine learning experts. And of course, we have this wonderful collaboration going with Princeton called Mind's Eye, where we're doing real brain decoding, not the stunt, not something, we're trying to look at hidden states of the mind, not things that are obvious that you can see, you can understand by just looking at the person doing a task, but maybe contextual questions about what they're thinking or very unconstrained interpretation of their thought. So these are difficult challenges, and with Princeton and the great neuroscientists there, we're making great progress, and this work is founded on that collaboration. Okay, well, we have to start with some cognitive neuroscience. Who's a cognitive neuroscientist here? Don't be shy, raise your hand. We got one. Okay, some research on it. See, we're all bashful about that. Actually, we're all converts. It didn't exist. This field did not exist 20 years ago, and so there aren't a lot of mentors in it. It's a fusion of psychology and biology and machine learning. It's an interesting space, but now it's a formal term. It refers to the study of how consciousness and other cognitive processes arise in the brain or the mind. Mind-brain thing is something interesting to study too. It's not really a duality, but we use that as a handle. Those terms to handle. And so we'll talk about this. And I wanted to start by giving a quick definition, but then give you some examples of what I mean by this. So, like I said, we're studying the processes, the neurobiological processes that underlie cognitive processes like attention, control, and decision-making, and I'll give you some examples on that. And so some of the interesting questions we're asking are, what specific structures in the brain contribute to certain human operations? So when we're doing attention, where does attention come from? Like, what is controlling it? What does it connect? What centers does it connect? What are these centers doing that it connects? What's the difference between sequential learning and parallel processing in the brain? How does learning occur? How does function differ amongst people? How do we align brains and compare them functionally? So things like that. And so luckily, being machine learning scientists, we have some data to work with, and we get that through both the behavior we can model, tests and stimulus that we see, along with neuroimaging data. We can look at things that the person can't directly tell us or the animal can't tell us. Okay, so here's an example of one study that our team's doing with Princeton. So we're trying to understand decision-making and see if we can model like the rate of a person making a decision and how certain they are about it, given context. So if we tell them something in the past and it informs this decision, how does it affect that model? And so here's a simple example. It's kind of a wacky chart, but I should have a mic. That's too bad. You can see at the top that there's a stimulus presented like on a screen in front of the person. So it's A and then Y. We tell them that when you see the sequence A and Y, we want you to push a button left, and when you see a sequence B and X, we want you to push a button right. And so what we're trying to do is model how that decision to push that button actually happens, and whether we can model it with the right timing and the right error rate and so on, in the presence of noise as well. So we'll insert other characters between these two symbols, and we'll change the distance between them and see how that affects our model. And so you can see that the confidence in this model going up would indicate we think they're going to push the left button, down to the right. And so you can see when we tell them A, they're thinking about the target, they get a really strong, they're anticipating something coming that would indicate a left button push. And then over time they start to forget about that as they look at other symbols. And then they get this target, Y, and they either push the button or they don't. And in this case, the target that was presented was not what they were expecting, and we predict the other button. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to model in terms of human behavior. This had nothing to do with neuroimaging data or anything like that. But what we want to ultimately do is bridge this sort of model with a model that is informed by an EEG or MRI, and see if we can set parameters on them by crossing a bridge between the two models, like fusing them into one. Here's another example. So we think a lot, and I think this is a good example of what we can learn in machine learning from human intelligence that we don't quite understand yet. So here's the value of forgetting. We don't think about that a lot. How have you thought, man, I'm so glad that I can forget? Oh yeah? Okay, yeah. There are some things I'd like to forget too, definitely. And if this talk doesn't go well, that'll be in that file. But if we give people a sequence of letters A, B, C, and so it's this tuple that we're going along, and we tell them what we want to do is like randomize maybe the third letter and see how well they can remember the sequence and the target, which would be that third letter, if we put random noise into what that letter is. So if it's totally random, they should not remember anything. They should be selectively forgetting sequences where the last letter is totally random, right? That'd be a waste of capacity, right? So in fact, that's exactly the effect you see if you do it right and you give them the right lures. They will. The charts are just showing their recognition accuracy under the effect of noise and certainty and so on. And this is the kind of process we're starting to see how the brain efficiently stores information, not just how it stores information, but why it forgets. There's a reason for that mechanism, and so these studies also shed light on that. And then this is really cool. And by the way, that last study was also done by our Princeton colleagues, and so is this one. This is one by Yuri Hassan at Princeton, who also given an excellent TED talk related to his work. And this is really cool because we could do this experiment right now. So the question is, how do brains couple when someone is narrating and someone is listening? And so does the signal just get mirrored in your brain? Are there other centers that are unique that light up? And this is an example of looking at the kind of distributed processing the brain does, even when it's focused on just one task, like listening. Well, hopefully you're not going through your grocery list right now. But that kind of thing. And this is interesting to me because that means that, as I'll talk about in a bit, we know that representations of neural networks are stored not in just one unit. We know that these get distributed. And that's true also in the brain. It's not just local interactions that are important, like the visual cortex, but also these distant connections and the correlations between activations between one center and the other in surprising areas, not just audio, the auditory and visual complexes, but also places that recognize higher level features like the face recognition or a scene recognition location. These are actually specialized centers of the brain, along with other higher level prefrontal cortex centers. So that's really cool. And being able to, this is another reason we want to be able to compare function across brains, which means we really have to develop technology that maps differences in anatomy and differences in function. So even with the same anatomy, people would have light up a little bit differently. And this is a really challenging problem because we don't have the labels on when these different regions should light up or what they even represent. So this is very difficult. Much more difficult than analyzing a photograph where we all look at and know most of the time what exactly we're seeing. Okay, so that's all cool. And cognitive neuroscience has been humming along for a number of years now until some people that you may know published a really interesting tome on Well, it was kind of cheekily called the appeal of parallel distributed processing back in 86, so 30 years ago to this date. But actually, it's sort of taking a hit at the cracks in the foundation of what cognitive neuroscience had been based on to that point. So in the 50s and 70s, what people thought was that the brain was like a symbolic computing engine, and then it was like the connections in it were hard connections. You know, it was this thing either relates to that, or you should do this when you do that. And the children learn these really strict rules, and when they learn everything at once, and it's done, and it's done for good. And this didn't. The problem was that there were like a number of aspects of the theory that they were observing, and experiments didn't match this model at all. And these gentlemen thought that there was an obvious better solution. It shouldn't be that the symbolists that were doing this work should just evolve a little bit, which they were desperately trying to do, by the way, to create some fuzz in the logic and uncertainty and so on, accommodate it. But they should really radically overhaul this thing. So if you have the time to read this, this is awesome. It's a 2-volume thing, and I think it's just it's a beautiful piece of work, and it stands. These ideas are still disruptive 30 years on. And I'll read through a list of them, and you'll recognize them in the current work we're doing. Many of us in deep learning, so it's just amazing. So that's what happened, and so this has really changed cognitive neuroscience and now machine learning in a big way. So, as I mentioned, like on the left is where the symbolist brain that would recognize a knowledge representation of an object and its relationship in the world. And you either know those connections and you've learned them, or you haven't. On the right, we have more of a probabilistic or a connectionist apple, which may be a neural network or something else. And so I'll show you why the one on the right is a much better model for the human brain in terms of the way we learn and other characteristics that we can explain these days. And so, but before I do, since we've already broached the subject of neural networks, I want to dive into that a bit. How many of you work with neural networks today as a tool? Use it like as a data scientist or in your application work? How many of you develop neural network algorithms or optimize neural network algorithms at a low level? Okay, a few. All right, so I apologize. Some of this is remedial. I hope to put some interesting bits in there too. So what the cognitive neuroscientists were after is what this delivers here, which is we need to store representations across the network. So we want to provide stimulus and input to the brain on the input layer, and we want the brain to figure out how things are related on its own. We want this process to be gradual. We want to be able to adjust the influence on these edges between these different whatever representations it learns. These are latent features or representations that we're learning. These aren't explicit things like an apple or a stem. This could represent part of our concept of what an apple is, or it could have no mapping to the physicality of an apple in each one of these units. These units are storing weights from these edges and an activation function that, given a threshold in the function, will activate the output of this thing. So yeah, that models the human the way the brain works. I mean, if a neuron gets enough input, electrical input from different pulses fast enough on different inputs, it will actually also pulse on the output, and it'll modulate itself that way. And interestingly, for cognitive neuroscientists, the cool thing is this, so that when you're using the network, you actually put an input in input layers, and you see what comes in the output. And then when you want to correct the output when you're learning, you compare the output with the desired or expected output with what you're getting, and then you use the derivative chain rule to propagate the errors back to every unit and make small delta adjustments, and we call that back propagation, and we continue that iteratively until this thing converges, if it does converge. And that's really cool because that's the way the humans learn. They've found that by studying children, they don't learn one thing at once. We have this idea that
one day they just understand language, or one day they just understand a concept like gravity, and that's it. You can explain a concept to someone, they can remember that, but it doesn't really get baked in and utilized for quite some time. And it also is that if you study them over time, they pick these things up over time. They remember a little bit more every day. They're a little more accurate with their responses every day. And that's the way that a neural network would respond under training. So we want it to learn incrementally with new information. We want the learning to be spread out over the network. We don't want it to be concentrated so that it's one unit's there or not, then we have learned or we haven't learned. And this has been verified in the human brain by knocking out parts of it or having people that have accidents. They don't lose their entire capability most of the time to do something. They learn part of it's degraded, and it's degraded gracefully most of the time. All right. So you know that after you've trained such a network, it's been proven over and over and in different ways that neural networks can, with enough layers, and width can not only represent arbitrary functions like this XOR, which is really hard to do. For a linear classifier, it's not possible with one layer of a perceptron here, which is just one form of these networks. But it's more interesting that if you make the width of the hidden layer there in the middle in red infinite, this thing, and certainly if you increase the depth, you could model any arbitrary function with this network. Any arbitrary function that you could draw the output for, you could model with the neural network. So they're really powerful for that too. That means that they can do general learning. Okay. So I guess the last thought I want to say before I go to those is the tenets that came out of that 30-year-old tome that are surprisingly modern is that, you know, up till the point that that work was published, neuroscientists had argued, and the symbolists had argued that, look, studying the brain is like studying software. You know, we only need to understand the software. When you develop software for a computer, you don't have to understand how the hardware architecture works. And the software will run on this system or that system or that. You have to examine the neural net of the human brain. And it turned out that we know that today that's not true, and that there's a big interplay between the two. And have you ever programmed a GPU? So I think we get too close to the subject matter and don't realize that computer architectures are pretty much the same. If you look at the scope of it, they're all von Neumann architectures, load store architectures. They have very similar instruction sets. And as a programmer, most of the time we can forget about it. But even when you go to just a GPU, which is a lot more similar to an Intel architecture, for example, a CPU, than the brain is to one of these things, there are big differences. So the answer is no. We were losing a lot by ignoring the hardware. And in fact, the hardware is basically the algorithm. The way that algorithm, how effective it is, depends a lot on the underlying interconnectivity of the neurons and how they learn. Okay. So with that digression over, here's what Hinton and the others at Rumelhart had proposed. So they said that anything that we use to do distributed processing and learning for cognitive neuroscience should include, well, they noted that these are the observations and the things they were after, and then they provided some proofs, a little bit hand-wavy proofs, but proof of the point in terms of research, that cognitive processes arise from real-time propagation of activated weighted connections. So they went through the fuzzy logic and different arguments to make that point. Then they talked about, you know, representations, which are things, you know, concepts that we store, images that we store, things that we store in these units that we store in these units of the neural network are patterns of activation distributed over ensembles of units, and they made the analogies to knocking out parts of the brain and talking about that and how that's appropriate. And the processing is interactive, it's bidirectional. So we have forward propagation, we have back propagation. When there's a link, information flows both directions on it during learning and during, you know, recall and so on. Knowledge is encoded in the weights. And you pick an activation function, and then the weights are the way you encode this. We found we've encoded an amazing number of things just by changing weights. Now, in the future, and in the human brain, actually connections are formed as well. The neurons grow, they change their connectivity to their neighbors and long-distance connections. So right now, in a lot of neural networks, we're ignoring that. The weights also change, like their sensitivity to a certain input And we have that model. But there's a lot more to go, and if you've been following Pedro Domingos at University of Washington and the fusions of the different schools of thought of machine learning, that's probably where we're going to go with it all, right? We're going to bring different schools into the connectionist school and solve this limitation. And so we talked about learning and how it happens over long term, what changes to the weights. And then finally, I mean, learning is continuous, as we've seen in children. And these things obviously depend on the environment. Otherwise, we wouldn't worry so much about the inputs that we present the network with. So, I mean, to me, this was written 30 years ago, and that sounds like a description of a deep learning network to me. It sounds like a neural network. You know, I can't find a single thing on that list, and that is all of them. I didn't hold back any of their tenets. That's exactly what they listed. So I was amazed. And this was remember, this is at a time where they're trying to argue that this old school of thought and what applies in cognitive neuroscience and the types of things they're trying to modeling was, you know, way against them. It was they were in the minority when they listed these things. How am I doing for time? I feel like I'm going really slow. All right. Really, how am I doing for time? I have 10 minutes? All right, great. It's always 10 minutes. Okay. So anyway, after that, after the kind of the floodgates were opened and people accepted this, then there was an opening on the machine learning side to accept these new ideas and to start implementing them, and there was acceptance in cognitive neuroscience. And these are just a few things that we've learned since then about machine intelligence that we've exported from human intelligence. So I'll just leave you with that. And there's an example of a 6-layer network of the actual cortical column of the human brain. So it's just amazing that it's always been there in front of us. So then after that, of course, we started emulating cortical columns and deep structures like that, and we found, as we expected, that they can model arbitrarily complex objects and input and do amazingly accurate tasks, and that continues today. And I'm sure that you're aware of all the visual recognition challenges. It's amazing how they've become so diverse. So, for example, in the lower right-hand corner, that's a new one from Princeton where they're trying to predict where a person will look when they look at a scene. And so that can be done with some accuracy. It's just like, how would they know where someone's going to look? I mean, I guess it is intuitive to you, but can you explain that to a computer, right? Well, no, and luckily with this type of learning, we don't really have to understand that for it to work. But part of this talk today is try to better understand how these networks work, so I shouldn't dwell on that too much. Even on the last MLconf, I believe it was the very last one, Alex Smola talked about the attention network, which has shocked me. It's a prime example of like the kind of work we're doing and how it may bake itself into machine intelligence someday. So the idea was to, can you actually guide a deep learning network to pay attention to the right parts of an image and then have it do the deep learning on those parts, so like a query process. And so this is an example. You take a convolutional neural network, which has got a lot of spatial neighbor information in it, good for image processing, and you interplay it with a long-term, short-term memory or a network that understands sequence, and can you do question answering with it. So you put in the question, the lower network analyzes the question, determines where it thinks the top network should be looking. The top network looks for that type of object information, returns a result, gets a little more clarity, is guided somewhere else, returns a result. So you can see that in this question of what is it that's sitting in the basket on the bicycle. It literally first determines there's a bicycle with something connected to it. So you can see the wheel and the dogs highlighted, and then just the dogs, which is the answer. Somewhere with cognitive neuroscience and machine intelligence. That's really cool. All right, so great. Let's give ourselves a pat on the back. This stuff is really effective, and it's being used all over the place in grand demonstrations, and it's going to change our lives for sure. But you know, it's amazing how little we understand about these things, and yet we're using them so effectively. And it's almost striking in that I can't think of another class of machine learning where we're that far behind. You know, the understanding and that the effectiveness is so great. So how do we, you know, these features that we encode in them, how are they represented, and are they the same across different networks that are trained on the same data? We don't even know that, you know, for sure. Like, you know, you've seen examples of the cat neuron here and this and that, but is it, if you train with different initialization weights, different copies of the network on the same data, will they all have that neuron? And will it be one neuron in one and it'll be several units in the other? We don't know, right? What's the capacity? What's the limit of the learning that these networks can do, theoretically? What's the trade-off between how efficient they are, like the human brain worries about energy use, and how flexible they are for processing? And is that a trade-off? And how do things interfere with each other that we learn? Like, oh, there's a cost to learning something. That's why we want to forget, right? So now with my 5 minutes, I think we started late. I think I had 40 minutes. All right, everybody's gonna do it. So let's get into this a little bit. And that's what I promised to do. So let's get through a little. So the first thing is, let's learn something about representation. So interestingly, just this year, in a computer vision conference, ICL, a top-tier conference, there was some interesting work called convergent learning done, which asked the question that I just asked you, which is, do you learn the same representations in the same network that's trained on the same data consistently? And so what they did is they took, there's a deep network above. It doesn't matter really what those represent, but those represent, filter functions and these units that we're analyzing over layers. At the bottom, we have the same network. It's another one that's been trained with different initialization weights, but on the same data. It's the same network structure. And then we want to see if there's a possible mapping of the units. So can we identify the one that activates the most strongest when we see a cat in this network and correlate it with one in the other network, or a set of units in the other network? We can't assume they're one-to-one. And so that's what the green does. And they used a very smart trick of sparse representation to try to hone down what the most important mapping was between these two representations in these networks. And they found that, yeah, you can find it. You can train this on ImageNet, for example, if you do these challenges. That's what this was trained on. And you can look at the, you do a type of agglomerative clustering, and you can do this matrix, and you can identify, that in one network, you can find the representation of that same image. This is an image processing network, so the same image pattern in the other, and you can point to it and say, that's the one that stores the same information here that one has over there. And so that's really good news, because now we can formulate theories about these representations, not worry about whether it only holds for one specific case that we're studying, right? So we need a foundation like that. Okay, but that's not cognitive neuroscience. And now, so the question is, what can it donate to this cause? And so what's interesting is that both cognitive neuroscience applications, so cognitive neuroscience is an application also for neural networks. We build models that are neural networks to explain human behavior and image data. And machine learning, they both benefit from these properties. The ability to learn these complex representations and account for a bunch of constraints, which is what's cool about neural networks. You can put all the constraints you want on information that you represent in arbitrary ways. And the ability to process a wide range of disparate representations, or tasks, I'll call them interchangeably. And we could call that multitask learning. So multitasking to you might be, can I use my phone safely while I'm driving my car? Can I text someone? No, you can't. Can the network do two things at the same time? That's interesting. Maybe you're doing that already in your work. It's an interesting question. And can it do two things ever, even sequentially? That's the other question, right? So that's well, we're interested in networks that can do a lot of that, because that makes them more useful. But what are the limits of this? So what's interesting is the human brain is giant in terms of its connectivity and the number of neurons. So it's a massive parallel processing machine. So you'd think that it'd be able to multitask all over the place and do all kinds of things at the same time and store a huge number of representations way beyond what you can remember on a daily basis, right? So why can't it? I mean, is it just an oversight of evolution? Why is it not behaving like a massive parallel processing machine? That's the first question we ask. So fine, you can store the representations. Why can't you retrieve them in parallel and use them in parallel and so on? Well, we know that you can't, because you can talk to any pilot about that. Even when they're trying to save their life or the lives of others, they have to scan instrumentation one at a time and then correlate with what they're supposed to be seeing and look at other instruments and correlate the readings between them. So there's clearly a limit to this, even when you put people under life or death situations. So this is the statement of the puzzle, which is it's one of the most remarkable puzzles, which is why in some cases can we do a lot of things in parallel, like locomotion. I'm gesticulating with both hands right now. And I'm not thinking about the left and right, but I'm doing it. So why was I able to do that, but then, you know, I can't do mental arithmetic while recalling my grocery list. Maybe you can, but I can't do that yet. I'm trying. So that's the puzzle. And the theory is that, you know, I mentioned it earlier a little bit. So if a unit learns two aspects of a concept, and they share that unit, then they may interfere with each other. That's the intuition you should have. If the units are less efficient, they may, if you're less efficient about it, you can dedicate units to different concepts to the limit where you're like the symbolist and every unit is a concept, right? If it was complex enough unit to encode the information, which is another weird question. So there's that question, and then there's the, you know, so the more that things interact, the stronger the imposition of seriality in the system. And so this may be a fundamental trade-off that the brain has made in evolution to be efficient. It can store everything efficiently, or it can do everything at the same time and do more, but it can't have both. All right, so we can get quantitative about that. I mean, first of all, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. So there are things you can do, like echoing back what someone's saying and copy typing at the same time. You have no problem doing those. They use different centers of the brain. In the hidden layer of the brain, though, we can up-level the neural network to looking at like the cognitive process level, because it just mirrors the underlying physical neural network. It aggregates it. There are other tasks like dictation and reading you can't do at the same time. You just can't do that. So we would suppose that the phonological and the orthographic centers interfere, and that they're shared. They store common representations that need to be used serially. All right. Are you ready to be guinea pigs? Because I'm going to put you to the Stroop test. So if you use Lumosity, you already know this, but we've got to do it so you can actually experience this while you're thinking about this problem. So are you ready? So what I want you to do is I want you to say the color of the letters, not what the word says. We're going to all do it as a group. And it's important that you do it as soon as you see it so I can test your timing, because that's key to the experiment, all right? So you ready? So again, say the color of the word, not what the word says. All right, I hope this thing works and that my machine doesn't crash. All right, here we go. Go. Blue, red, quick, quick. Black, green, blue. Ah! Green, yellow, blue, black. All right, you could, yes. There's clearly two distributions there of response, right? There's clearly. What if I turn the words upside down? What do you expect will happen? All right. Can't read it, yeah. All right, go. Green, yellow, red, blue. So, you were faster and you were less dispersed. Clearly it was like that. Ha! So do you see? Those are the response times, like aggregated over a number of reactions. So there's tens of seconds there, but tens of responses. And you can see that it's, the second experiment, they were very clustered with no interference, and then the other one, yeah. So today we explain the Stroop test, okay? There it is. So my co-PI at Princeton, it described it in 1990, this network which hadn't been tested with data, and so we've actually now tested it and quantified it. Actually, as part of a submission that is impending, we'll have more information on this. But what you can see is that the theory is that there's this is under active, control requiring things. So there's some automated processes just work, but there's other things that require override, and that's represented by a task vector. If I ask you to verbalize the color or verbalize the word, those are two tasks that are encoded by this task vector, which is another input to the neural network. By default, if you don't apply that work, the control override, the network just takes the most reinforced positive and the least reinforced negative connections. And so in that case, it's just answering the word to verbalize the word, and it's ignoring the color input, right? So this is an example where there's interference in the internal representation of the brain. Now, this is a very simple neural network, but you could extend this to any number of layers, and you will find these properties also statistically in deep learning networks. So that's the interesting part. So just a couple of years ago, we first found this trade-off of efficiency of representation and the ability to do things in parallel, and also showed that even a modest amount of multiplexing really severely limits the parallel processing capacity, no matter what the scale of the network. So even with the brain with 100 billion neurons in the prefrontal cortex, is going to be severely limited in the amount of parallel processing it can do, even with small amount of statistical cross-connects, which are surely there for efficiency and reuse. I mean, that's how we assimilate information so efficiently. You don't have to learn everything from scratch. Most of it's already there. You just attach another connection to it and use it for a new purpose. So we looked at different types of interference. There are different canonical types of interference. 2 units talking to 1 unit talking to 2 units that are interfered down a different layer. We set up this network to do the study of how this responds to statistical characteristics. So we studied it by, so the network that we're studying is the bipartite graph, like an input stimulus and an output task. We converted that into an interference graph, which just means that a task is a pair of these input outputs. So 1 and 1 prime is a task. I'll show you a word, you verbalize it. You verbalize its color, you verbalize the word. So that'd be 1 and 1 prime, 2 and 2 prime, for example. If they're in the interference graph, we put each of those pairs of nodes into one node. We map it. And if there's an edge between them, then those tasks interfere. And the challenge is to find the maximum independent set of this interference graph. So how many of these things are not neighbors? The biggest set of that within any graph at any time is the number of parallel processing tasks you can do at once. That's the same as the MIS. So it's a lot easier said than done. This is the kind of the conceptual approach, and there are many tricks, and you'll be able to read our papers shortly to understand them. But so what's interesting is that we found that an information theoretic approach could help us. So we changed what we call the distribution complexity of the connections to study it statistically. So if they're all uniform, do you think there's more or less interference on average? So if like 1 unit talks uniformly to as many as possible, would there be more or less? Yeah, more interference, but more efficiency. And then so this measure, this information theoretic measure measures the lumpiness of that distribution, how uniform it is. So that we were able to look at that. And then what we could do is, and we do it for a small network first, is we look at the MIS, or the parallel processing capacity, as a function of the input and output distribution. So the P is just a uniform, how many, the input layer, how many output layers it connects to. And we wanted to sweep that as a parameter. And then this whole thing is pinned on one setting of distribution complexity for the inputs to the output layer. I'm sorry, it's a little confusing. And then we just swap the network size. And what you see in the lower, this one shows you kind of the characteristic, but in the upper right-hand corner is a larger network of 50. It's the same thing, it even gets stronger. Basically what you see is that the parallel processing capacity is severely limited even for a small bit of process overlap at reasonable amounts of distribution complexity. And we'll see that over orders of magnitude. So ergo, the brain is very limited because of the cross-connecting that we believe that it has, that we're going to go prove using neuroimaging and other methods now in experiment. Whoops. All right, so anyway, we did a simulation. This is the neural network we simulate. So we not only modeled it, but we also generated a bunch of weights and starting points and trained a bunch of networks to see if they actually had this characteristic and what else we could learn. And so we studied 20 network groups that are randomly initialized, and we trained them all on the same stimulus and trained them to do 16 tasks. We trained them to do the tasks one at a time, and then we wanted to see if we just trained them for one hot task, like, I want you to give me this output when you get this input, and then this input, and then this input, and that output, and that, and so on. How much interference would they inherently have, after the weights were trained? It was an interesting question. So what we were measuring then is how well they could generalize. So we would try them on pairs of tasks and other tasks that we hadn't tried to specifically make them multitask for, and measure the mean squared error on doing those tests. So did they activate the wrong output and how much? That kind of thing. And so what's interesting is that we found, for one, you can actually encourage the network to reuse representations. So if the weights are more uniform when you start, or smaller initialization values, the network tends to fall into these shared representations. And then the task, if you look at how the tasks activate the hidden layer, the activation vector is similar for different tasks. So that shows us that they're encoding the information similarly. Yeah, I'm way over. Someone else is going to have a very short talk. Okay. The weights are more randomly initialized wildly, then the networks tend to not learn shared representations. They tend to be less, the internal activation vectors are less correlated like on the right. So that means that, yeah, as deep learning researchers, we should be aware of how weights affect shared representation. That's the new learning here. It's very interesting. The efficiency of your network and how much it can recall and how much recall interferes with another recall depends on this. And we've got more sophisticated ways that we'll describe in our papers of initializing the weights and studying that. And so anyway, I just want to say that there's a trade-off between generalization and parallel processing capacity, and we show that here in the graph. And we've quantified more about the parallel processing capability. We call it capability when we're not sure that we actually can measure the quantitative capacity yet. We have a feeling for the trend, how it depends on initial weights as well. So, with all that said, there's a lot to do. We want to. These graphs were not weighted. Their connections were there or they weren't. We've actually got a model now with weighted edges, and it makes the analysis, the statistical analysis, a lot more complex. But we're using graph theoretic approaches to study the networks with weighted graphs. So we'll study deeper networks now. So next year for NIPS, we hope to have, boom, a full deep learning network, and we analyze its characteristics. So that's hopefully the groundbreaking work we get done. And we'll study whether human performance mirrors this in the lab at Princeton by putting people in MRI systems and scanning them while they do tasks and studying their performance. But I have to remind myself as I close that as much as I feel good about what we know, we still don't know a lot about the human mind. There's a lot to learn and export into machine intelligence. This is the nematode. It's an ugly little worm. It only has like 300 and something neurons. And there's been a challenge like for 20 years out there to take its data set and model how the brain works for it. We can't even do that for 300 neurons. So how can we hope to understand 100 billion neurons in the human prefrontal cortex tomorrow, right? Let's not kid ourselves. No one has done that yet and modeled that worm. So we have to have a little bit of humility with this whole thing. So with that, I'm done. Thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it.